In the 1920s, the problem of race was still dividing people as ever before. Of course, this issue was not exclusive to the 1920s and had been seriously debated, peacefully as well as violently, since the emancipation of the slaves following the end of the Civil War. But in the 20s, there were quite a few developments in race relations. The Harlem Renaissance was picking up speed by the middle years of the decade, and this empowered many Black Americans and struck fear into many whites. If you want to know more about the background of the Harlem Renaissance, you can check out my other video about that. But without further ado, let's get into this video. So why did the race problem really blow up in the 1920s? First, let's go into a little background in the years leading up to the start of the decade. Like I mentioned before, one of the reasons was Black empowerment. In addition to the Harlem Renaissance, Black soldiers had served in the First World War and had proved to many of their white contemporaries that they were capable of just as much bravery as them, despite fighting for a country that continuously put them down. The most famous of these soldiers were the members of the Harlem Hellfighters, who earned a glorious reputation as a feared fighting unit in France against the Germans. These veterans, upon returning to the US, where racial prejudice and discrimination still plagued the land, wanted to use their patriotic service as leverage in the improvement of opportunities for Black Americans. However, this vaguely corresponded with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, who had reformed in 1915 after being dormant for many years. They cropped up again in force, inspired by the 1915 epic film Birth of a Nation, which presented a very distorted white supremacist view of post-Civil War history. Based on an equally, if not more, racist novel, Black people are depicted as power-hungry after emancipation, and only through the formation of the KKK was their tyranny overthrown. The film's popularity was a testament to the widespread effect of the race problem. In the immediate post-World War I period, there was an outbreak of racial violence. The worst of this occurred in Chicago and Washington, D.C., as well as a small town in Arkansas in the summer of 1919. The investigation of a young Black boy who had drowned in Chicago was derailed when the police refused to believe that a group of white men had killed him. It was widely believed that the boy was killed for accidentally crossing into white territory. To make matters worse, police instead arrested a Black man for the murder. Violence erupted in the city and raged for 7 days, all of it racially motivated. This resulted in the deaths of 38 people, 23 Black and 15 white, and an additional 537 were injured on both sides, with more than 1,000 Black Chicagoans left homeless. News of the initial incident spread across the country, causing more violence in Washington, D.C., leading to 6 more deaths there, 4 white and 2 Black. Yet more violence occurred in Phillips County, Arkansas, when another small incident, perhaps exacerbated by the news of the Northern killings, turned into a full-fledged battle between Blacks and whites in a small town, where gunshots were exchanged. The official tally of those killed was 30, 25 of them Black, but Black witnesses claimed that more of them were killed. This string of incidents was appropriately called Red Summer for all the blood that had been shed. And this brings us into the 1920s. After these killings, anyone who thought significant progress had been made in race relations were probably feeling very disillusioned. The fact that the violence had occurred not only in the South but also in northern cities was especially alarming. The early 1920s saw a short but sharp increase in so-called race riots. I only use the term race riots here because that is what they were called at the time, but it should be noted that this was a term that was used to place the blame squarely on Black people, and probably shouldn't be used in modern times when referencing these events. From now on, I will use other, more appropriate words like massacre or violence instead. Perhaps the worst of these massacres was in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, where 36 people were confirmed killed, 26 of them Black, 10 of them white. Though it has been estimated then and recently by independent sources that the death toll of both white and Black people was much higher. There were also other incidents in Florida in 1920 and 1923, adding at least a few dozen more deaths to the count. But the worse, longer-term effect was that in all of these cases, whites expelled Black residents from their towns, a clear and direct sign that they were not wanted there. Even as late as the 1920s, the belief that Black men were out to deflower young white women still prevailed in parts of the South. Many of the lynchings in the post-Civil War period began When a black man was accused of raping a white woman, or perhaps even just making any comment that could have been interpreted as lewd or suggestive. In most cases, the accusations were very trumped up or often just flat out untrue. After the massacre in Rosewood, Florida in 1923, we can see this belief, as well as others, in the white newspaper reports of the incident. One Florida newspaper wrote, "Words cannot express the horror of the tragedy at Sumner and Rosewood and Levee. A brutish Negro made a criminal assault on an unprotected white girl. As long as criminal assaults on innocent women continue, lynch law will prevail, and blood will be shed." Another white newspaper disapproved of lynching, but still showed clear signs of racial prejudice when it wrote, "The crime of rape will never be tolerated for one single moment. Congressmen may rave and froth and pass laws as they please, but the time will never come when a Southern white man will not avenge a crime against innocent womanhood. Nor will the men of the North tolerate it any more than the men of the South." Some black-owned newspapers issued a call to arms, probably much to the dismay of many black intellectuals. One black newspaper wrote, "Things have come to the place in this country that the only course for the Negro is armed resistance. The states refuse to protect us against the mob, and the federal Congress has washed its hands of all anti-lynching legislation. Lynchers are free to prowl the earth and butcher any Negro who gets in their path. The only way for the black man, then, is to keep his powder dry and shoot back." For an overview of racial violence in the year 1920 alone, I found this excerpt from the leading black periodical of the time, The Crisis, which shows a slight improvement from the year before, but was certainly not a sign of major progress being made. During the year 1920, there were 69 persons lynched in the United States. Of these lynchings, 60 were Negroes, of whom 1 was a woman, and 9 were white men. Compared with the year 1919, this shows a decrease of 17 among Negroes and an increase of 5 among white people. In modern times, we might think that the race problem back then was pretty black and white, no pun intended. But there was a huge amount of nuance, and black Americans, average and intellectual, were not exactly unified in the ends nor the means. So let's take a look at some of the prevailing stances on the issue from the black perspective. First, let's look at the base of sorts for the 1920s. For this, we'll go back in time a bit to the previous couple of decades. Prior to World War I, probably the most important black leader in the US was Booker T. Washington, who founded the Tuskegee Institute, a black university dedicated to creating more intellectual opportunities for black Americans. Washington was in favor of what I will call white appeasement. This stance accepted the social and political superiority of whites in return for black people being able to properly educate themselves with white financial support, and receive equal treatment in the courts and in all legal matters. It might sound bad to us now, but there was a bitter racial reality to face at that time. This know-your-place attitude was heavily criticized in the post-World War I period and into the 1920s. Washington died in 1915, so we didn't witness the Red Summer, and one might wonder what he would have thought about it. One of Washington's followers in the early 1900s was W.E.B. Du Bois, who broke away from him and created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. Du Bois continued to be active during the 1920s and long after, pursuing an entirely different strategy than Washington had. Du Bois insisted on total racial equality, and was far more publicly outspoken about injustice, lynching, and social discrimination. He continued to be very influential in the movement, especially in his position as the editor of the black periodical The Crisis, the official monthly periodical of the NAACP. Du Bois was an enthusiastic supporter of the Harlem Renaissance and furthering black artistic expression. He also achieved more mainstream fame when he famously debated with a member of the KKK named Lothrop Stoddard, and made him look very foolish very publicly, as a massive group of onlookers numbering in the thousands watched. Du Bois's stance is definitely the most modern, and by that I mean the view closest with that of people today. But there was yet another movement that really got going in the first half of the 1920s. The leader of this movement was Marcus Garvey, who had grown up in a middle-class family in Jamaica, moved around Central America in his 20s, then on to the UK and Europe, before eventually returning to Jamaica and establishing his own organization for the improvement of black people, with a desire to create his own black college modeled on the Tuskegee Institute. As the president of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, or UNIA for short, he traveled to the United States in 1916 and created a UNIA branch in New York City. Membership for UNIA skyrocketed in the late 1910s, and by the early 20s had become a major school of thought for the race problem. But what was that school of thought? Garvey was a proponent of black separatism, meaning that he thought black people should voluntarily separate themselves from whites and become completely independent from white society. In the aftermath of the Red Summer, as well as later racial violence such as the Tulsa Massacre and equally violent incidents in Florida, it's not too difficult to understand why many black people supported this movement. And as we saw earlier in that excerpt from the black newspaper after the Rosewood Massacre, there were more than a few people who believed that violence and belligerence was the only way to end the race problem. Garvey also supported the Back to Africa movement, in which a return to Africa would geographically rid the independent black nationalists of white domination. However, he believed that only black intellectuals should migrate to Africa, and in fact, he himself never actually visited Africa at all. Garvey was also a prolific speaker, often using violent rhetoric that one could have easily interpreted as a suggestion for violence against whites. For a slightly more modern comparison, Garvey could be considered the forerunner for Malcolm X, who had also advocated violent action when it seemed like civil rights progress was too slow. In the end, Garvey's time as a black leader in the US was short. In 1922, he was charged with mail fraud and convicted the next year. He was let out on bail and continued his activities for a while before being arrested again in 1925 and imprisoned until 1927. He was pardoned by President Coolidge and deported back to Jamaica. Then he eventually traveled to England, where he died in 1940. Garvey was a polarizing figure among black Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois was especially critical of his movement and considered him to be a stubborn hindrance in the fight for racial equality. This is understandable from Du Bois's perspective because Garvey wanted exactly the opposite of what he wanted. Garvey was also deemed a hypocrite by many, especially black intellectuals, who pointed out his support of the Back to Africa movement despite not actually going to Africa himself. But while Garvey can be seen as a cartoonish figure, his success with his radical beliefs demonstrates the level of frustration many black people were feeling at that time. Many were tired of trying to do things peacefully and failing again and again, so that progress seemed nearly impossible to achieve. And they were willing to achieve their goals by force if necessary. It's also important to note that Du Bois, being an intellectual, was not really appealing to the lower classes. While his method might seem to us now as being the most dignified position, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of a lower-class black person at that time. Booker T. Washington's and Du Bois's methods were slow, and it might have seemed like little progress was being made to an outsider. But Garvey appealed to the black people who were especially downtrodden. He promised quick results that would begin to positively affect their lives very soon. In the end, Booker T. Washington's views became unpopular after his death in 1915, and Marcus Garvey's arrest and eccentric behavior discredited him to many, so W.E.B. Du Bois's approach to the race problem came out on top. And this would largely continue until the civil rights movement a generation later. Though, as we all know, the fight was not yet over. So, as always, I hope this bigger picture video was easy to understand. There's always a lot of information to digest in these types of videos, so I hope I did a good job presenting it. At some point, I'm gonna upload some supplemental videos relating to the stuff I talked about in this one. There are plenty of primary source documents that I would like to read out and share with you all. But that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.